66-year-old Geraldine Largay was nicknamed Inchworm by her friends for her hilariously slow hiking pace. But her slow pace didn't stop her from doing the thing that she loved, which was to hike. And in fact, on April 23rd, 2013, Geraldine, along with one of her close friends, Jane Lee, decided to embark on this nearly 1,000-mile-long hike through the Appalachian Trail. Geraldine's husband of 42 years, his name was George, he planned to drive ahead of the pair and meet them at prearranged spots along this 1,000-mile-long journey to give them supplies and would occasionally bring them to a motel so they could shower and sleep in a bed. By June 30th, so more than 2 months after they had started this journey, Jane finds out that she has a family emergency and she isn't able to continue this hike. Geraldine decided she was going to finish what she started on her own, despite the fact that realistically she hated hiking alone. She was very scared, frankly, of being out in the wilderness by herself, but she only had about 200 miles left, and so she figured, what the heck, I'll finish this thing out on my own. Later, Jane would tell investigators that when she left the trail to handle this family emergency, she felt like Geraldine was a little bit in over her head. She was someone that just didn't do well hiking on her own, and she still had 200 miles to go. But Jane just had too much going on in her life, and so she didn't stick around to try to convince Geraldine to come with her. Instead, she said, "Best of luck, Geraldine, and I'll see you at the end." So for the next 3 weeks, Geraldine carried on down the Appalachian Trail on her own, and by all accounts, it was going really well. She was checking in with her family and saying, "This is the mile mark I'm at," and she was making all her rendezvous points with George to get resupplied and to go to the motel with him. And so everything was going great. Then on July 22nd, Geraldine would send a text message to her husband George saying that she thinks she's in some trouble and that she lost the trail and is now lost. And she would ask him to call the Appalachian Mountain Club and see if they had a trail maintainer that could come out and look for her and kind of get her back on track. The problem was Geraldine couldn't get these text messages to go through. There was very bad service where she was. So she begins to walk to higher ground to try to get a better cell phone signal. And so she goes up this hill and she repeatedly tries to send these text messages out to George to say, "I'm lost and I need help," but none of them were going through. She would spend the whole night trying to send text messages from this mountain before finally putting her sleeping bag down and sleeping for the night. The next morning she got up and she sent another text message, this one a little bit more urgent, to her husband. She told him that she was lost since yesterday and was off the trail 3 or even 4 miles and that he should now call the police. But that message also failed, and so none of her messages over the past 24 hours have been sent out, and so nobody knows that she's lost. But at some point that day, she decides, I'm gonna just put my phone away, save the battery life, and just wait, because I'm supposed to meet my husband today, and when I don't show up, he's gonna call authorities, they're gonna come looking for me, and everything will be fine. She leaves the mountain and finds this area underneath a couple of trees that had some pine needles on the ground. It was relatively soft. She set up her tent underneath these trees. She hangs a silver reflective blanket up over one of the trees to try to signal to helicopters or anybody flying overhead. She even began burning some bark to create a smoke signal, and she proceeded to wait. And sure enough, later that day, George, who's waiting at the rendezvous point for his wife, she doesn't show up, and he immediately contacts the authorities, who launch a huge search to go find Geraldine. Tragically, Geraldine was actually only about a mile, maybe 2 miles off of the trail. So she was not far from where she needed to be. But because it was so densely forested, she had no way of knowing that, and sound didn't travel very well. So over the course of the next 2 weeks, as this huge search with helicopters and planes and people on horseback and hunters and all these people in the area, they didn't find her. They might have come very close to her without knowing it, but again, because it was so densely forested, they never linked up. So on August 4th, about 2 weeks into this big search, they end up scaling it back and say, "Sorry, but we can't find her." The whole time this is going on, Geraldine stays at her campsite. She doesn't go anywhere. She figures, this is my best chance to survive. And she's staying very positive. She has this journal that every day she would write inside of it a daily observation, and she would also write letters to her family. All of these messages were incredibly positive. She was very much expecting to be rescued and would have this great story to tell. But as days went on and no one was finding her, you could tell in her writing that she had come to terms with the reality that she was not going to make it out of here alive. And so before she died, she wrote this beautiful message to her husband and to her daughter. "When you find my body, please call my husband George and my daughter Carrie. It will be the greatest kindness for them to know that I am dead and where you found me. No matter how many years from now, please find it in your heart to mail the contents of this bag to one of them. 2 years later, a forester would be in the area and would come across Geraldine's tent that was now crumpled and collapsed. And inside, he would find Geraldine inside of her sleeping bag with the journal over her chest. And inside the tent, she'd kept it neat and clean all the way to the very end. This is someone that went out with absolute grace. Back on July 22nd, 2013, the day Geraldine would go missing, she woke up and she was all smiles and motivated to start the day. She heads off down the Appalachian Trail at about 6:30 in the morning, and she passes by another hiker who stops Geraldine, and apparently this hiker saw Geraldine smile and said it was so infectious that she had to take a picture of her. And so Geraldine laughed and posed for this picture. After the picture was taken, the women laughed about it and then went their separate ways. And then by 11 a.m. that morning, Geraldine was lost. On August 20th, 1989, Eric and Lyle Menendez returned home to their family's mansion in Beverly Hills and knew right away something was wrong. The driveway gate was unlocked, and then they went to their front door and it was already open. They pushed the door open and cautiously walked inside and saw there was blood on the ground and looked in their TV room, and there, slouched against the couch, was their father, Jose, and their mother, Kitty. They had both been executed. Eric and Lyle are beside themselves. They call the police, and they're in total hysterics, screaming for the officers to get there, that someone's killed their parents. The police show up, they go inside, and just based on the brutality of the injuries, Jose and Kitty had clearly been gunned down with shotguns and multiple blasts, because pieces of them were missing. They were just totally destroyed. The police, because of that, assumed this has got to be a mob hit. There is some real aggression here. This is not an accident. This is a statement. The police immediately turned to Jose's business. He was the CEO of this very prominent media company. He had made millions and millions of dollars. He was very well connected, and they figured that somewhere in his dealings, there must have been a bad actor that was after him. And so for the first 6 months of the investigation, the focus was almost exclusively on Jose's business contacts. Meanwhile, Lyle and Eric seemed to go totally crazy. They immediately inherited the $14 million family estate, and there was this huge cash payout right up front. And so the two of them go on this insane spending spree over those first 6 months. They bought condos on the water, they bought cars and Rolexes, they bought a chicken wing shop for $550,000. I mean, they were just buying things left and right. During their parents' funeral, Lyle was overheard talking about how he can't wait to go to the US Open, and look, I just bought a new Rolex. His mind was not on the fact that his parents had just been savagely murdered. It was on, what fun thing am I going to do with my money next? After the funeral, Eric decided he was going to put his energy into becoming a professional tennis player. So for $60,000, he hires a tennis player to live at his house and work with him every day on tennis, even though realistically Eric was not a very good tennis player. But that was his focus. That's what he was going to work on. And Lyle spent most of his time building a team of people that could help him make investments into different companies in and around New York and New Jersey. But in addition to spending tons of money on their respective career interests, the brothers were also going to therapy sessions. And during one particular closed-door session, Eric would tell his therapist that me and my brother actually killed our parents. Eric clearly believed that he was able to talk to a therapist about anything and nothing would escape this room, that it was totally confidential. But what Eric wasn't planning for is the therapist's assistant was outside the doors walking by and overheard Eric say it. And she would tell the police would confront Eric as well as Lyle, and very quickly Eric and Lyle would confess. During their confession, they told investigators that on August 18th, they went out and purchased 2 shotguns and they stored them in their home. The next day, on August 19th, the brothers and their mom and dad go out on a fishing trip together the whole day. They come back, and then on August 20th, the 2 brothers retrieve their shotguns while the parents are sitting in the TV room, and they walk in and fire 15 shots into their parents, obliterating them. Afterwards, the brothers would ditch their shotguns and bloody clothes, and they would go to the movie theater and they would watch Batman. After the movie was over, they go back to the mansion knowing exactly what they're going to find, and they go in and they put on this big performance. Oh my goodness, someone killed our parents! But it was all a lie, because they killed their parents for their money. Eric and Lyle were given life sentences and were sent to separate prisons, but actually just recently they were reunited in the same jail. 30 years after their crime, a guy who collected NBA trading cards was rooting through some of his older cards, and he came across the Mark Jackson 1990 card. And he noticed in the background of the picture, sitting courtside, is none other than Eric and Lyle Menendez. It was during that 6-month crazy spending spree after they had murdered their parents, when they were going around buying up whatever they wanted, and they had bought courtside tickets to that particular game, and they happened to be immortalized on this playing card. Known as the Grizzly Man, Timothy Treadwell was, above all else, a huge bear enthusiast. His passion for these creatures led to a passion for environmentalism and for documentary filmmaking, the subject of which were the grizzly bears of Katmai National Park in Alaska. And so starting in the late 1980s, Treadwell began going to Katmai National Park and setting up a camp there for the whole summer and filming all of his interactions with the grizzly bears. During the first half of the summer, Treadwell would stay in an area that he referred to as the Grizzly Sanctuary. It was this area near Hallow Bay. It was this big open green field, and all the grizzly bears seemed to just converge on this one area and kind of mosey around and be lazy. They were not aggressive at all towards Treadwell, and so he could walk up fairly close to them and just shoot great footage of these huge animals. During the second half of the summer, he would leave the Grizzly Sanctuary and go south to an area called Kaflia Bay. And it was a much more densely forested area with lots of grizzly bear trails. Treadwell could use vegetation to get right up close to some of these bears without them necessarily seeing him. He referred to this area as the Grizzly Maze. Treadwell developed a fairly bad reputation amongst the park rangers of Katmai National Park because he was pretty reckless about how he interacted with these animals. I mean, they are big, wild predators, and he would get right up close and in their personal space, and every time he was just rolling the dice because eventually they thought something bad was going to happen to him. Treadwell believed he was taking every precaution and that what he was doing was safe, but Treadwell had become very emotionally connected to the grizzly bears he was seeing at Katmai National Park. He felt so comfortable with them that he would actually walk up sometimes and pet and goof around with the bear cubs. And for whatever reason, the grizzly bear parents would not harm him. And so he felt like he was kind of one of them, and they respected him and they welcomed him into their environment. Normally, whenever Treadwell went to Alaska for the summer, he would go alone. It was just him and his camera. But at the end of the summer, in October 2003, when normally Timothy would leave Alaska, because October is the time when the grizzlies become more aggressive because they're trying to eat as much food as they can before going into hibernation, Timothy decides that instead of leaving, he's going to extend his stay one more week, and he's going to fly his girlfriend, Amy Huguenard, into Alaska to spend that week with him. Friends and family did not think this was a good idea, but Timothy was like, nope, it's going to be just fine. I know these animals better than anybody else. They are not going to hurt us. So he flies Amy in, and they set up camp along a grizzly trail inside of the Grizzly Maze. Neither of them were carrying a weapon or bear repellent spray. A week later, when the pilot returned to pick up Timothy and Amy, he looked up the hill and he could clearly see their campsite was not broken down. They had not packed it up yet. They were not down at the shoreline. So he gets out of his plane and he starts walking up the hill towards their campsite, thinking maybe they lost track of time. Maybe they don't know they're getting picked up today. And as he crests the hill, he sees there is a huge grizzly bear pacing around as if guarding its prey in the middle of this campsite. The grizzly sees the pilot and makes a move as if he's going to run towards him. The pilot turns, runs back to his plane, and flies out of there. And he calls park rangers and alerts them to this grizzly bear that's in the middle of Timothy and Amy's campsite. When the park rangers finally arrived and made their way up to the campsite, they could tell right away that Timothy and Amy were deceased. Their remains were scattered all around this campsite. It was clear that a grizzly bear, or more than one grizzly bear, had absolutely ripped them to pieces. However, this wasn't even the most horrifying part of this discovery. As the bodies were being taken away, the park rangers began bundling up their stuff to take with them, and they found inside the tent a camera that had a 6-minute tape on it. At first, when they hit play, they thought it was a blank tape, but it wasn't. It was just inside the tent when it was recording, and so it had no visual, but then they started hearing audio. And for 6 agonizing minutes with a blank screen, they heard crystal clear audio of Timothy and Amy being eaten alive by a grizzly bear. The audio suggests that Treadwell had left their tent because they heard a bear outside and was attacked. and he starts screaming for Amy to come outside. The bear has Timothy's head in its jaws, and Timothy is screaming, "It's killing me, it's killing me." And Amy is screaming back, "Play dead." And at some point, it's clear that's not working. They have no way to fight the animal. And Timothy starts yelling for Amy to run away. She's paralyzed with fear. She's screaming at the top of her lungs. And then Timothy is groaning and screaming. And eventually it stops when he drags Timothy away. And then Amy doesn't try to run away. She's just kind of frozen in terror. And you hear the bear come back. And then her screams pick up. And then the tape goes quiet. This is the last picture of Timothy and Amy taken alive. It was taken right after Amy had landed in Alaska, and they were going to make their way up to the grizzly maze and camp out there for a few days in hopes of running into a grizzly bear. Andrew McCauley was an adventurer. He started as a rock climber and mountaineer, putting up dozens of big wall routes in Australia, as well as alpine first ascents in New Zealand, Patagonia, and the Himalayas in the 1990s. He took little interest in the marquee peaks. He preferred obscure, lesser-known peaks that were more challenging and complex. But in 1998, he fell nearly 30 meters during a climb and shattered his knee, which made it almost impossible to climb at the level he was climbing at before the injury. This injury that initially seemed like a really big setback because he loved mountain climbing, it ultimately spawned his true life passion that he didn't even know about, and that was sea kayaking. He took to kayaking because it didn't really require the use of his legs, and so he was able to continue to push the limits of his mental and physical endurance, but wasn't hampered by a knee injury. And much like his mountain climbing career, he very quickly began conquering all of the most difficult open ocean kayaking routes all around Australia and New Zealand, to the point where he had done all of them. The only one he had not done was the Tasman Sea. Andrew estimated it would take him approximately 1 month or maybe a little bit longer to cross the 1,000-mile journey. Now, his biggest obstacle was not going to be his own physical or mental endurance. It was going to be the weather, because you're going to be out on the water for at least 30 days. There really isn't a weather window you can shoot for. You can't time this journey so you don't hit a storm. It's more about when you hit the storms, how will your kayak hold up? Other kayakers that had attempted going across the Tasman Sea had used these custom-built kayaks that had these elaborate canopies over the top of them, and they had these self-righting systems where if it flipped, it automatically popped right back up. But Andrew wanted to do it with just a basic kayak. He didn't want all the bells and whistles. He wanted this to be kind of pure. But he did need to create a sort of system to protect himself in the middle of one of these storms. And so he literally went into his backyard and constructed this fiberglass that looked like a trash can that sat over his cockpit on the kayak that he could remove and put on the back of his kayak. And then if he wanted to sleep, he could put it over him, and it was sealed and watertight, and it would protect him from the storm. And if he flipped over, he wouldn't just sink and drown. He called this dome Casper, and he painted a big smiley face on it. And so after months and months of preparing for this journey, finally on January 11th, 2007, Andrew would kiss his wife and his young son goodbye. He would hop in his kayak along with Casper, and he would set sail on his solo journey across the Tasman Sea. For the first 2/3 of the trip, it seemed to be going extremely well. Andrew was checking in regularly on his radio. He had enough food and water. His kayak was holding up. Casper was holding up great at night, so he was able to get some sleep. But some really bad storms that he was anticipating began rolling in kind of all at once in that final third of the journey. During one particularly bad storm, Andrew would remain locked underneath Casper for 28 straight hours as these 30-foot waves would just wreak havoc outside, flipping his kayak over multiple times. I mean, just absolutely terrifying stuff. Inside his kayak, he had this beacon that if he pushed the button, it would send a GPS signal to the rescue crew that would immediately come out and they would save him. And the whole time he's getting thrashed around out in the middle of the ocean, he never presses the button. Because much like he didn't want to have all the bells and whistles on his kayak, he also didn't want any help. So instead, he would send kind of sarcastic text messages to the people on shore, making light of the situation he was in. Like during this storm, he sent a text message that just said, "No picnic today." 12 days after that particular storm, where he was locked inside for 28 hours, he had made it to within 80 miles of the finish line. And so he texts his wife and just says, "See you Sunday at 9 a.m. This was on a Thursday. And so when his wife, Vicky, gets this text message, she's so excited. She gets together everybody that wants to meet him at the finish line. And in fact, they all go there early on Thursday to just hang out and camp out until he arrives. But 24 hours after that text message was sent to his wife, Andrew would send a distress signal to the New Zealand Coast Guard. On the recording, Andrew sounds desperate. He also sounds deeply fatigued, or maybe even hypothermic, and he's pleading with them to come rescue him because his kayak is sinking. At first, people, including the Coast Guard, thought this could be a hoax because Andrew was so competent out on the water, and he had just gotten in touch with his wife the day earlier saying, "Everything's great, I'm almost done, I've made it past all the hard stuff, I'll see you on Sunday." But of course, they still send out a search crew that night to look for Andrew. They can't find him, so the next day, on Saturday, they expand their search and they do find Andrew's kayak, except Andrew's not in it. The only thing missing was the canopy to the kayak. The rest of the kayak seemed to work just fine. His distress beacon had not been pressed, his GPS was still there, and his camera was still there. No one knows what happened to Andrew in his final hours before he ultimately disappeared. The prevailing theory is he must have been capsized and separated from his kayak, and then was unable to either get back to it or even climb back in because he was so tired. This is the final picture that was taken on Andrew's camera, and you can tell from his expression that he's not particularly happy to be in the situation he's in. And in fact, in some of the earlier video clips he shot, he actually says to the camera that he feels like he bit off more than he could chew, and that he wishes he could just be home with his wife and his son. Despite extensive search efforts, Andrew was never found. In 2005, Addie Hall met Zach Bowen when they were both bartending in New Orleans. Addie liked to give Zach a really hard time and kind of played the mean girl as her way of flirting with him, but really what she was doing is testing Zach to see if he could put up with her because she had a mean streak. She would have these crazy, angry outbursts and would yell and scream at people around her, and then she'd turn it off just like that, and she needed to make sure that he could put up with her. Zach, it would turn out, had his own mean streak and his own angry outbursts, and so in many ways they were very similar. Many of Zach and Addie's friends that were around them in those first few weeks they were together did not think this relationship would last very long because of how often they fought with each other. But it just so happened that Zach and Addie had met one another just weeks before Hurricane Katrina came through New Orleans and just devastated the area. And so before it arrived, Zach and Addie decide, let's stick it out. Let's stay here together. Let's ride this storm out together. And it was actually that storm that brought them together, and they both fell madly in love with each other and became totally inseparable. After the storm cleared, Zach and Addie went out into the streets and began cooking food for people, and they had all this alcohol in their apartment, and they set up a makeshift bar outside in the French Quarter and were just giving away drinks to these people whose lives had been devastated by this storm. Their tale of love and colorful survivalism attracted many media outlets, including the New York Times, who did a feature on them. For a time, Zach and Addie felt like the king and queen of the French Quarter, and they were so happy. But when reality set back in and the real cleanup ensued and electricity was restored and people started moving back into their homes and people started going to work again, Zach and Addie were forced back into their old lifestyle, something neither of them wanted to experience again. So for the next year, Zach and Addie struggled to make ends meet. Their bills continued to pile up, and really those two were at each other's throats all the time with these horrible, vicious fights. In October of 2006, when it seems like Zach and Addie's relationship is really on the rocks, they decide in order to reinvigorate their relationship, they're going to move out of their current apartment where there's lots of bad memories, and they're going to move into a new one. They found a little apartment over the famed Voodoo Temple on Rampart Street, and they immediately made a cash offer and they moved in. No sooner had they moved in did Addie go down to the landlord and say, remove Zach from the lease. She had found out that he was cheating on her, and she was preparing to kick him out of her life. Zach found out that he was not on the lease before Addie could confront him about it, and it turned into this wicked fight between the two of them. A couple of days later, Zach showed up for work at the bar, and some of his coworkers recalled that he was acting really funny. He was wearing a hat pulled down low over his head and sunglasses and was really quiet. And when anybody asked him, like, what's going on with you? Why are you acting so strange? He would just tell them he was fine and would quickly walk away from them. Around the same time, Addie stopped showing up for work at all, and her coworkers turned to Zach and said, "Where's Addie?" And he would say that they got into this fight and that Addie had actually left New Orleans and gone back to her hometown in North Carolina. And some people thought that was a little bit fishy because Addie loved New Orleans, but anybody that knew Addie knew she was very unpredictable, and if they had had this huge blowout fight, it is possible that she could have left for North Carolina. A week later, on October 17th, 2006, the New Orleans police receive a phone call from a hotel in the area that spotted what they think is a body laying on the roof of their parking garage. When the police arrived, they could tell it was a deceased man and that he had died from impact, but they couldn't tell if it was a murder, a suicide, or a tragic accident. So they began searching his body to see if there was any indication of what happened. And they pull out a note that's addressed to police in his back pocket. The note is fairly long, but he communicates to the police that this was not an accident. I had to take my own life because I took a life. And if you go to my apartment on Rampart Street, you'll find the body of my girlfriend, Addie Hall, who I killed. Police rush to the address that was given in the note. They're horrified at what they find inside. As soon as they stepped into the apartment, the temperature dropped. The air conditioning had been set to the lowest it could possibly be, so it's very cold in the apartment. And they look around and they see these strange messages spray painted all over the walls. Things like, "I'm a total failure," and "Look in the oven." And there are arrows pointing on the walls towards the kitchen and towards the oven itself that's sitting in the kitchen. And sure enough, when they open up the oven, they find Addie. Police also found Addie's journal, and inside of it, Zach had left an 8-page, very detailed confession of how he had strangled Addie and then had tried to cook her to make it easier to dispose of her body, but couldn't finish the job, and that's when he went to the hotel and threw himself off. Here are some crime scene photos from outside the apartment as well as inside. You can see some of the messages that Zach had spray painted to the wall indicating to go check the oven. And here is the infamous oven where Addie's remains were found, as well as a message left in the kitchen saying that he was sorry he couldn't finish in reference to his inability to finish cooking her and disposing of her body. Crazy as it sounds, this apartment is still being rented out today, and it includes this exact stove. Hisashi Aochi was married, had a young son, he smoked a pack of cigarettes a day, he played rugby in high school, and by 1999 he was employed as a technician at the JCO Tokimura power plant. He and his colleagues had been tasked with creating the fuel for a fast reactor called Joyo. Since 1993, the company JCO that owns this power plant that Aochi works for, they had been cutting a lot of corners to increase productivity and profitability, but at the expense of safety. In fact, the company had their own in-house rules that totally went against nuclear power plant regulations. They called this the Shadow Guide, and within the Shadow Guide, there were very specific steps that were totally unsafe and unregulated to create this fuel for this Joyo fast reactor. On September 30th, 1999, Aochi was creating this Joyo fuel, and he was leaning over this large steel containment tank, and he was holding a funnel. One of his colleagues was above the tank, pouring in this potent solution through the funnel into the tank. The tank they were using that was prescribed under the Shadow Guide was not actually designed to hold the amount of radioactive materials that were being put inside of it. And so as Aochi and his colleague are creating this mixture, a very dangerous event occurred known as criticality. One of the survivors who was sitting away from the tank behind a desk described this event as being an extremely loud bang followed by this blue flash that filled the entire room. And what that blue light was extremely high levels of radiation. And because Aochi was the one kind of leaning over the tank, it all went right through him. By the time a rescue crew got in the room to help them, Aochi is uncontrollably vomiting and he's lightheaded and dizzy. He does not have any physical wounds. This was not an explosion, so there's no lacerations or anything on his body. But he had been exposed to 17 sieverts of radiation, which is the highest amount of radiation any human being has ever been exposed to in documented history. Aochi was airlifted to a hospital, and doctors and nurses were actually kind of amazed at how well he was doing in those first few days. Again, he did not have any burn marks or anything on his body. He did have a little bit of redness on his right arm, which was positioned directly over the tank when this criticality event occurred. But he was in good spirits and was even joking around with the staff about how he can't wait to get home. In reality, Aochi died as soon as he was exposed to that criticality event and received 17 sieverts of radiation. He was in what's known as walking ghost phase, where due to high levels of radiation, all of his chromosomes had been obliterated, which meant his body did not have a blueprint to reproduce cells. So basically, he appeared alive and well because his body had created all of these cells in his body before the accident, but as those cells died off, they would not be reproduced, which means in walking ghost phase, your body is turning into a corpse, but you're alive to watch it happen. Tragically, after doctors discovered this about his condition and they informed Aochi of what was going on, Aochi did not seem to think there could be that serious of consequences for being exposed to that level of radiation. He felt like he was in the clear. He had made it past a couple of days. He thought maybe at worst he would develop leukemia later in life because he thought that was a thing with radiation. And really his concern was that he might have to stay in the hospital for a little bit longer. He just wanted to go home. 3 weeks after the accident, his intestines began to hemorrhage and his skin fell off. All of it. They attempted numerous skin grafts to try to keep his bodily fluids inside of him, but none of them took, so they began wrapping him in gauze like he was a mummy. By November 27th, which is 2 months after the accident, miraculously, he was still alive. However, his pain levels were so high, they had to put him into a medically induced coma. While he was in the coma, his heart would stop and he would need to be resuscitated 3 separate times. And on the 3rd time he was brought back, he would say, "Stop. Stop, get out of the room, leave me alone." But they didn't stop because the doctors and nurses were very interested in studying the effects of this level of radiation and how well he would respond to treatment and just trying to learn as much as they could about this event because it had never happened before. And they probably justified it by saying this will save other people's lives. But what that meant is Aochi would need to suffer unbelievable levels of pain. Nearing the end, when Aochi could still speak, he told the doctors and nurses repeatedly that he is not a guinea pig. Finally, a do not resuscitate order was put in place, and in relative short order, Aochi passed away after 83 days of just unbelievable agony. The truly famous picture that is associated with this story is unbelievably graphic, and I did not want to share it on this channel. However, if you feel so inclined, it's not that difficult to find online. This picture, however, is equally disturbing because it's of Aochi right after he's arrived at the hospital. He is in that walking ghost phase. All of his chromosomes have been obliterated. He is effectively dead right now in this picture. He just doesn't know it yet. In early August 1945, warfare changed forever when the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan. These bombs would devastate the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, killing over 100,000 people. America's goals in dropping these 2 bombs was to hasten Japan's surrender and end World War II, as well as avoid any further Allied casualties. But America also wanted to showcase to the world, really the Soviet Union, that it had this new, extremely destructive technology at their disposal. So on August 6, 1945 at 8:15 a.m., the crew of the B-29 bomber Enola Gay dropped the first ever wartime atomic bomb over Hiroshima, Japan. At the time, Hiroshima was a bustling regional hub that served as a military communications center, storage depot, and troop gathering area. When the bomb detonated over Hiroshima, immediately there was this flash of boiling light that scorched everything it touched. The blast burned at 10,000 degrees Fahrenheit, and the 70,000 people that were within 1,600 feet of the initial blast radius were instantly incinerated. After the dust had settled, 5 square miles of the city were just rubble. The Sumitomo Bank was within that blast radius. That morning before the bomb detonated, an elderly resident of Hiroshima had been sitting on the front steps of the bank waiting for the doors to open. They were clutching their walking stick and they had their other arm against their chest right as the bomb exploded. And when it did, they were one of the 70,000 people that were instantaneously vaporized. This Hiroshima shadow, as it's called, is all that is left of this person. Their shadow remained on the front steps of this bank for over 20 years before they finally removed that section of the stairs and brought it to a museum. In 2008, famous inventor Peter Madsen, along with a former NASA contractor, began what they called the ultimate DIY project in Copenhagen, Denmark. Their plan was to build a rocket ship from scratch and then fly it into space. This project made Madsen and his partner kind of like anti-establishment celebrities in Denmark. But by 2014, they still hadn't completed their rocket ship, and in fact, their efforts were stalled because Madsen and his partner had this really public, nasty falling out, and Madsen had actually left the project and moved literally across the street and set up his own rocket building project with a separate team. 3 years later, in 2017, a freelance journalist named Kim Wall, who was staying in Copenhagen with her boyfriend at the time, heard about the rival rocket ship makers and wanted to do a story about them. In the 4 years Kim had been a freelance reporter, she had traveled to places like Haiti to write about practitioners of voodoo, to Sri Lanka to document the tourism that goes on their former battlefields from their long civil war, and to Cuba to follow the underground network of people bringing TV and internet culture to the people. Kim was fascinated with what she called the undercurrents of rebellion, and here was just such a story literally down the road from where she was staying. She desperately wanted an interview with Madsen, but he was proving to be very difficult to get in touch with, and as months went on and still no luck, she was starting to lose hope that she would ever get to do this story. But on August 10th, 2017, the day before she and her boyfriend were planning to leave Denmark, she got a text message from Madsen saying that not only would he do the interview, but he would do it that night while riding on his homemade submarine. Prior to being known for his rocket building escapades, it was this homemade submarine that really put him on the map of famous inventors. Kim immediately said yes, this is exactly what she was hoping for and then some. The idea that she got to write from the submarine would only add to the story. Before she left, she asked her boyfriend if he wanted to come along, and he would say that he was really close to wanting to go, but their friends had thrown them this big going away party because they were going to leave the next day. And since Kim was already not going to be there, he told her he would stay with all their friends to make sure they weren't too upset and that she should just go have a good time and that he would see her in a few hours when she got back. Kim leaves their apartment and heads down to the dock to meet Madsen. She and Madsen would get on the homemade submarine at 7 p.m., but before going underneath the water, Madsen thought it'd be funny to drive past their apartment so Kim could wave to her boyfriend and all of her friends that were at this party. And so they drive past the apartment. Kim waves to her boyfriend and all the people at their going away party. Her boyfriend would take a couple pictures of her, and then Kim would go back down into the submarine. Madsen would follow her, close the hatch behind them, and disappear into the ocean. Later that night, when Kim still hadn't returned, Kim's boyfriend started to get worried that something could be wrong. They did have a flight very early the next morning, and so it seemed odd that they wouldn't be back by now. And so he took his bike and he went down to the dock and he just waited for them. And by 1:45 in the morning and still no sign of them, he decides to call the police. Police launch a search, and all night they're looking and they can't find the submarine. They can't get in touch with Madsen. The next morning, the submarine was spotted near a lighthouse, and one of the boats that was out looking for them saw Madsen climb out of the hatch right as the submarine actually sank into the water. So Madsen's now swimming in the ocean and the submarine's gone under and there's no sign of Kim. The boat goes over and picks up Madsen, brings him to shore. Madsen would tell police that he started to notice some ballast issues with the submarine and he thought it might cause it to sink. And so he took Kim to the surface and dropped her off at a nearby island. He went back down into the submarine to try to fix the issue. He said he couldn't do it and he was only able to barely escape before the submarine ultimately sank. And if you just go over to that island right over there, you're bound to find Kim. But Kim was never on that island. This is the picture of Kim waving goodbye to her boyfriend and to the goodbye party. Right after this picture was taken, Kim and Madsen would go down into the submarine. Madsen would offer Kim coffee and cookies, and she would sit down in the control area while Madsen would step away, go into his room, and begin watching videos of women being beheaded on his computer. Shortly after watching those videos, he walked up behind Kim and beheaded her. 1 month later, Kim's torso would wash up on a beach, and her head would be discovered in a plastic bag along with a knife. It's unclear why Madsen did this, but he had previously tried to get other women to take a private ride on a submarine with him. Kim was just the first person to accept. Madsen was given a life sentence. In 1978, 16-year-old Bridget Geiger was waiting outside her home in Ohio for a boy named Jeffrey to take her to prom. She wasn't particularly excited to go to prom with Jeffrey. He was known to be really nervous around girls, and so she figured it was going to be a pretty awkward date, but nobody else had asked her to go, and she really wanted to go to prom, so she said yes. When Jeffrey showed up, she was immediately disappointed. He was wearing this odd ensemble of vest and bow tie, as opposed to the standard tuxedo that she was anticipating him wearing. And so now they weren't going to match. He was also so nervous that he was visibly shaking and couldn't pin her corsage to her dress. And so Bridget's mom had to come out and put the corsage on. After the corsage was on, Bridget's mom would take a couple of very awkward photos of them kind of stiffly standing in front of her house before they ultimately got in Jeff's car and headed for the prom. When they arrived, Bridget wanted to go on the dance floor to see her other friends to kind of lighten the mood because she was not having a good time with Jeffrey so far. But she did stay with him, and it was clear that Jeffrey hated being at the prom. He hated being around this swarming group of teenagers. Bridget felt kind of bad and said, "Hey, Jeffrey, do you want to go sit down and just grab a bite to eat over at the little food cart they have here?" Jeffrey's very relieved and says, "Yes, I'd love to do that." And the pair leave the dance floor and walk over to the little food court area. As they're about to sit down, Jeffrey pulls the chair out for Bridget. She sits down. He kind of pushes her in like a gentleman. But then instead of sitting down with her, he just walks away without telling her where he's going. Bridget assumed he was just going to the bathroom, but after a really long amount of time had passed, and it was clear he had not just gone to the bathroom, she got up to go look for him. And so she went on the dance floor. She can't find him in the building, and so she goes outside to see if maybe his car's not there anymore. Maybe he just left. And she sees his car, it's still in the lot. When she turns around to go back into the prom, she sees Jeffrey sitting on a curb just eating McDonald's cheeseburgers. And she goes over to him and she's like, "What are you doing out here?" And so he told her that he just wanted to step outside and get a couple cheeseburgers and then come back and he would sit with her while she ate, but they wouldn't let him back in. And so he just went and got more cheeseburgers and thought he would wait here until she came outside. And now that she was outside, she couldn't get back in either. So she just says, "Hey, I'd like to just go home." And so Jeffrey is mortified and he tells her, "I'm so sorry. I wanted this to be a nice evening for you. I'm sorry it wasn't." He drives her home. He says goodbye. She walks into her house. He drives off, and that was that. Bridget only saw Jeffrey one more time after that. It was about a week after prom, and Jeffrey actually invited her to come over his house for what he was calling a house party. And Bridget's like, "There's no way this kid's throwing a house party. He can barely stand to be around just me, let alone a crowd of people." But she was polite and said, "Sure, I'd love to come to your house party." She gets there and there's no food, there's no music, there's like 3 people there. And as soon as she walks in, all Jeffrey wanted to do was have a seance and communicate with the devil. She was so immediately creeped out by Jeffrey's behavior that after only a couple of minutes, she just turned around and left his house party and did not see him again. Well, until 13 years later when she would read about him in the newspaper. 13 years later, on July 22nd, 1991, Milwaukee, Wisconsin police spot a man named Tracy Edwards running down the road in handcuffs. They run over to him and they say, "What's going on?" And he says that a man was holding him hostage in his apartment, that he threatened to kill me. I was able to overpower him and escape, and here I am. The police go to this apartment that he apparently escaped from and they knock on the door. The door opens and the police are confronted by this tall man who introduces himself as Jeffrey. He tells police this is all a big misunderstanding and that Tracy Edwards is a friend of his and I don't know what's gotten into him. And the police were actually close to believing him. They would even say he was really convincing. But as they're talking to him, one of the officers kind of looks behind Jeffrey into his apartment and he sees on the coffee table what are clearly pictures of dismembered body parts. And so they arrest Jeffrey, and when his apartment was fully searched, a house of horrors is revealed. In addition to photos of body parts, the apartment itself was littered with human remains. There were several human heads in the freezer and the refrigerator, and in his bedroom was a 57-gallon drum containing more dead bodies that were decomposing in chemicals. There was also evidence that suggested Jeffrey was eating these people. Now, Jeffrey lived in a crowded apartment complex, and so other neighbors had complained about this awful smell coming from his room, but he had been able to explain it away and convince everybody that it was just some bad meat. However, the most horrifying revelation about how Jeffrey was able to conceal these horrible crimes he was committing in the middle of a city apartment would come a few days later. Apparently, 2 months before Tracy Edwards had run out of Jeffrey's apartment in handcuffs and flagged those officers down, another boy had left the apartment in handcuffs and was running down the road, and police stopped him. But the boy couldn't really speak. He wasn't able to articulate why he was there or what he was doing. And as police are talking to him, Jeffrey comes running up the road, flags the officers down, and thanks them for finding his boyfriend. They had gotten into a lover's quarrel and that everything was just fine. And so the police shrug it off and say, no problem, we'll even give you a ride back to your apartment. And so they drive the boy and Jeffrey back to Jeffrey's apartment. They watch them go inside and the police leave. But if the police had paid a little bit more attention, they would have seen there was a hole drilled in the back of his head by Jeffrey. He had been pouring acid into this kid's head to try to control him, and that was why this boy couldn't speak. And as soon as the police let them go back into the apartment, Jeffrey killed the boy, because Jeffrey, Bridget's prom date, turned out to be none other than infamous serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer, who killed 17 people over a 13-year period. Just days after this picture was taken of Jeffrey and Bridget, right before they headed off to prom together, Jeffrey would kill his first victim and start that 13-year killing spree. Dahmer was ultimately given a life sentence, but was killed by another inmate. In 2011, Heike Dorsch and her boyfriend Stefan Rahman were living their best life sailing southwest from the Galapagos Islands. For the last 3 years, they had abandoned their lives in the city and had moved on to Stefan's catamaran and were just sailing the globe. On August 30th, 2011, after a particular stretch where they had been at sea for 17 days consecutively without seeing land anywhere, Heike was laying down on the catamaran catching some sun when she heard Stefan yell out, "Land!" And she looked up and she saw these mountainous islands kind of coming into view just over the horizon. These were the 15 islands that make up the Marquesas Island range within French Polynesia. Heike remembers not being able to control her grin. It was like she couldn't stop smiling because it really looked like paradise, and she was so excited to land there. The Marquesas Island range were not big tourist attractions because of how mountainous and rocky they were, and the water was not that beautiful Kool-Aid blue that people expect out of French Polynesia. But for Heike and Stefan, this was perfect. They were not looking for mass market tourism, they were looking for authentic cultural contact. And it would turn out that the Marquesas Island range was perfect for this because the locals just weren't used to seeing tourists. And so before long, the locals were embracing Heike and Stefan and bringing them down to the beach for their cookouts and going spearfishing with them. And even one night they were invited into a local's home where they got to be a part of a big family dinner. After 6 weeks, Heike and Stefan had explored the majority of the Marquesas Island range, but there was still one of the 15 islands that they had not yet explored called Nuku Haiba. And so on the day before they planned to leave the island range, they decided to go check it out. When they dropped anchor in the bay that sat just outside of this island, there were no boats, there were no fishermen, there were no people, there was nothing. It was like a deserted island. And so they make their way on the beach and they see there's this trail that goes inland. Being explorers, they couldn't help themselves but walk down the trail to see what's down there. After 15 minutes of walking down this jungle path, they come to a clearing, and in this clearing is this very strange looking village that's made up of all these shacks. They can't tell if people live there or have lived there recently because to them, it just looks totally abandoned. And as they're kind of looking around, they notice way down the path beyond these shacks is one man standing in the middle of the road. He's this really big guy with his shirt off, standing next to a horse, and he's just looking directly at them. He's not waving to them, he's not signaling to them, he's just watching them. And it kind of creeped them out at first, but they decided that the polite thing to do would be to go over and talk to him because this is probably his village and they were the trespassers. So they go over to this guy and they introduce themselves, and he says that his name is Arihano and that he lives in this village. Through broken French, they're able to have a semi-normal conversation conversation, which seemed like pleasantries. And at some point, Stefan, just off the cuff, asked this guy if he'd be willing to be his guide on a hunt. He wanted to go hunting for goats, which is something that everybody did on the Marquesas Island, and Stefan really wanted to be a part of that. And Arellano says, sure, I'll be your guide. Heike was a little bit caught off guard, but wasn't surprised because Stefan had been talking endlessly about how he wanted to go on a goat hunt before they left the Marquesas Island range. But she didn't feel like doing this, so she said, you two go, I'll meet you over at the boat. So Heike turns around and starts walking down the jungle path back towards their boat, and she turns around one more time and she sees Stefan and Arellano walking into the jungle down another path, and they disappear. Heike spent the next several hours just laying out on the beach, waiting for Stefan to return. But after quite a while, and she hadn't heard anything, she started to get a little bit worried. And as she's starting to get worried, she hears someone yelling out on the water. And from around the corner, Arellano comes around on his boat, and he's waving to her, and he's yelling for her in French that there's been an accident, that Stefan's been hurt, and she needs to come with him. Without another thought, Heike runs into the water, jumps into Arellano's dinghy, and the two of them drive back around the corner to wherever Arellano and Stefan had been. They land at this little tiny beach that's right up against a jungle, and immediately Heike jumps out, runs right into the jungle, and she's yelling for Stefan, and there's no sign of him. He's not yelling back. She has no idea where to look, and she kept turning around and asking Arellano, where is he? What happened to him? And Arellano just wasn't really giving her a good answer. He was just being quiet. Frustrated, Heike walks even farther into the jungle. She's yelling even louder, and still there's nothing. And so she turns around to confront Arellano and be like, where is Stefan? What's going on? And as soon as she does, she's met with a gun right in her face. Heike immediately grabbed the barrel and tried to fight it away from him, and she could tell that he tried to fire the gun, but the safety was on, and so nothing fired. They kind of struggled with the gun, and at some point he got on top of her and just restrained her and tied her up to a tree. And then he just walked away into the jungle without saying anything. And so Heike is expecting at any moment for him to return and kill her. And she even said that she wished he had just shot her then and there because the anxiety of waiting for whatever was going to happen was way worse. While Arellano was gone, Heike struggled to try to get the ropes off of her and the rope around her neck off of her, but she couldn't do it. And as she's sitting there struggling, Arellano would return and he would beat her up a little bit before ultimately turning around and leaving once again. Arellano would come back a couple hours later after it had gotten dark, and she's still there struggling to get these ropes off of her, and he would hit her a couple times before leaving again. But when he hit her, he actually managed to loosen some of her restraints, and as soon as he did walk off into the jungle that second time, she was able to get the restraints off of her wrist and her neck. Now, she had no idea where Arellano was, but as soon as she took one step, she saw a flashlight maybe a couple hundred meters away flip towards her, and she knew it was Arellano. He had heard her move. And so Heike just starts running full speed. She's stepping on thorns. She's getting slashed by all the undergrowth. She doesn't care. She is running for her life. And because it was a full moon, she could actually see the water because the beach was right next to where she was being held. And so she just ran for the water. And when she got onto the beach, she could see there was another boat out in the water near where theirs had been anchored. And when she looks at the beach, she can see that Arellano must have turned around because she can see a flashlight kind of bobbing its way farther and farther deeper into the jungle. Using the couple's satellite phone, Heike was able to alert authorities, who launched a search for Stefan, and initially they couldn't find him and they couldn't find Arellano. But 3 days into the search, they made a grisly discovery. The Marquesan Islands are actually known for the Marquesan warriors that used to inhabit these islands up until the 12th century, and they were known for being the most aggressive cannibals in the South Pacific. In particular, the island of Nuku Hiva, which is where Stefan had just gone missing, and where Heike had just been attacked by Arellano. But historians believe nobody on Marquesas has practiced cannibalism since the 12th century. That practice has gone away. Well, until 2011, when Arellano, who was in fact a Marquesas warrior, met Stefan and decided that now is a good time to bring that practice back. Right after Heike had turned around and walked back to the beach and Stefan and Arellano had gone on their hunt, Arellano had attacked Stefan, tied him up, and described seeing his neck pulsing with fear as Arellano built this massive campfire that authorities said was 3 times bigger than any campfire they'd ever come across. And then Arellano shot him and put him in the fire. Although Arellano would be captured and convicted of killing Stefan, Arellano would never actually come out and say that he had in fact eaten portions of Stefan, and it was impossible to tell from his remains how much had been consumed versus burned off in the fire. But virtually anybody who was involved in this case has their suspicions that Arellano had ritualistically cannibalized Stefan. In the early morning hours of February 6th, 2014, a van carrying 5 men finally came to a stop outside of a farm in Norway. After a miserable, nearly 15-hour drive, these 5 men who were from Finland were finally ready to begin their real adventure. They were going to be attempting one of the most dangerous underwater dives in the world. It is called the Traverse, and it is a 2-kilometer subsurface dive from one entrance of the Plura Cave to the other. The entrance they were going to start in was inside of the frozen pond next to this farm. 2 of the 5 men had actually done this so-called traverse before because they were the ones that discovered these 2 entrances were actually connected. But no amount of experience was going to limit the amount of physical risk they would have to take in order to complete this dive. The dive was so long, over 2 kilometers, that you actually needed a specialized underwater scooter that could propel you through the tunnel because you wouldn't be able to swim fast enough before you ran out of air. Which also meant if your scooter broke down in the middle of this pitch black underwater cave, you were screwed. The majority of the dive was going to be through this really tight tunnel where all along the ground were these limestone rocks that kind of poked up, where if you weren't careful, if you dragged your dry suit along them, you could tear it open. And then freezing water would go into your dry suit and you would die. Also, they were going to be using a diving rig known as a rebreather. So as a Navy SEAL, we used rebreathers. Basically, it takes your air and rebreathes it. So you're not breathing air into the water, you're breathing out into the system that scrubs your CO2 and then pumps it back into you. And you also combine that rebreathed air with pure oxygen, so you have a continuous cycle where you're just breathing pure oxygen. It makes for a really cool dive because you're looking around and there's no bubbles, but it's also very dangerous and your body doesn't really adjust well to having pure oxygen pumped into it. In fact, you can be poisoned from pure oxygen, and when you're diving at depth with a rebreather, on the way up, you can't just rocket to the surface. There are these things called decompression stops along the way up, where depending on how long you were at a certain depth, you need to wait at certain stops along the way back up to the surface and let your body decompress. If you don't do that and you just rush to the surface, you can get something called the bends, which is decompression sickness, and it can be fatal. Not to mention, there's a couple other nasty side effects of using a rebreather, like if you get water inside of your breathing loop, it can actually get into the CO2 absorbent that sits inside of your rig, and that can cause this acidic mixture to go back into your mouth. But you can't take the mouthpiece out because more water will get into it and it'll flood your rig and then you'll just drown. So you need to just accept that there could be acid in your mouth, and you need to either get somebody else to give you their mouthpiece or get a standby rig and breathe off of that, because there's no solution to this. You just got to have acid in your mouth. Also, if you panic for any reason on a rebreather, you'll be breathing really heavy and your system will not be able to scrub the CO2 fast enough, and you'll have a buildup of CO2 in your body and you'll get hypercapnia, which can lead to disorientation and even passing out, which can be lethal underwater. This dive was famously dangerous to the point where the best divers in the world wouldn't attempt it. They called it a death wish. But these 5 divers from Finland were determined and they were eager to make the traverse. So shortly after they arrived, they take a quick nap and then they get up and they're ready to start the dive. They decided to break up into 2 groups. They had a pair that was going to go down first, and then 2 hours later, the other 3 would follow. Once the first pair was in the water, there would be no way to communicate between the 2 groups. So the pair cuts a triangle into the ice with a chainsaw, they hop into the beautifully clear water, and very quickly they start descending down into this tunnel. Once they got down to the tunnel, they turned on their scooters and started heading out. After a couple of hours, the pair reached the most dangerous part of the dive, where the tunnel basically nosedives and goes straight down to about 130 meters. And as you're going down, you have to be very cautious that you're going the right way, because there's all these dead end tunnels that look exactly like the way you're supposed to go. And they go pretty far out, but if you were to accidentally take a wrong turn and go down one of these dead man turns, you wouldn't have enough oxygen to complete the dive. So it's a slow process of making sure you go down the exact right path. And then when you get to the bottom at 130 meters, there was this plate that had been left there to signify you've gone the right way. And then you turn and go right back up again, and you're pretty much at the exit at that point. But it takes quite a while to cover that last little bit because there are necessary decompression stops along the way. The first group descended with no issues and didn't get sidetracked. They got to the bottom where that plate was. They turned and began going back up the ascent to their first decompression stop. The lead diver got through a particularly tight spot and then noticed that his partner behind him, his flashlight, which was normally right up against him, he couldn't see it anymore. And he turned and he saw that his partner had gotten wedged in this one section of the ascent. So the lead diver turns around and swims down to the trapped diver, who he can tell is panicking a little bit because he's trying to get himself free and he can't move. And the lead diver looks and he can tell that he is thoroughly wedged into this one little section. And the lead diver would say that what he thought happened is the trapped diver must have been going too quickly with his scooter and basically motorized himself into this wedge. Like it wouldn't have been humanly possible to swim fast or hard enough to get stuck as badly as he did. The lead diver could tell that he was totally stuck. There was probably no way he was going to get out of this. And so he tried taking some of his gear off, but they have such little space to work with, and the trap diver is starting to sense that this isn't going very well. And in a panic, he accidentally knocks his mouthpiece out of his mouth and can't find it again and ends up inhaling a bunch of water and he dies. The lead diver knows that he can't panic because he will end up burning through his oxygen. He'll probably get hypercapnia. He won't be able to get to the surface and he'll die too. So he tries to free his friend's body and he can't. And he's now realizing that the second set of divers that are coming in the tunnel, they're going to get to this point in the dive, which is very far into the dive, and they won't be able to get past his dead body. And they'll have to turn around, but they don't have enough oxygen, he didn't think, to make it back to the surface. And so almost certainly those three divers are going to get here and be trapped and are going to die too. And so terrified and devastated and saddened by what's ultimately going to happen, he turns and starts heading for the surface. And he had to stop at each of those decompression stops. And you can only imagine what it was like to be sitting inside of this tight tunnel waiting for 30 minutes and 45 minutes at the different decompression stops, just thinking about what's inevitably going to happen beyond the dead body. They're going to get trapped. They're going to die. He's going to be the only one that gets out of here alive. And at some point he makes it up to the surface and he just sits there and waits. Meanwhile, the second set of divers did enter the water 2 hours later. They go down to the tunnel, they're making their way out, and they were farther spread out than the pair was. And so the first diver, the lead diver of the second group, he reached the dead body first before the other two had even seen it or knew about it, and he began to panic. And as the second and third diver come up and realize what's happening, they see the lead diver lose his mouthpiece, and in a panic, he's moving around like this, and he inhales water and also drowns. And so now the second and third diver are dealing with the fact that they just watched their friend die right in front of them. Their other friend from the first group is dead and blocking their way. And the second and third diver, they also begin to panic. They don't communicate, and one of them just immediately turns and starts kicking it out back towards the entrance, knowing full well they probably don't have enough oxygen to get there. The other diver decided they were going to find a way to get past the dead body that was wedged in the only way up to the surface. And so on their own, over a kilometer underwater in this tight little tunnel where they're totally trapped, they're relying on a flashlight for light. There's two dead bodies. This second diver begins removing pieces of their gear and pushing it through the little space between the dead body and the clearing that he wanted to get to make his way up to the surface. And after pushing through all of his gear, including his tank, which is a big commitment, because once it was through, he would have to go to the other side. He couldn't get it back through, and push himself through painstakingly with his hands all the way through this tiny little space that he could just barely get through. And then he puts his gear back on, and then knowing he had almost no oxygen left, he had to basically rocket to the surface and just hope decompression sickness didn't kill him. The other diver, who had turned around and gone all the way back to the entrance, they skipped all of their decompression stops as well. They got to the entrance just barely, but when they got there, the entrance was frozen over and they had to punch their way through the ice, which they were able to do, and they too got on surface once again. The three survivors linked up, they called authorities, they went to the hospital. They would make a full recovery. They told authorities where their friends were in this cave, but no one had the ability to get down and retrieve their body. So they sealed off both entrances to this cave and called it a gravesite and said no one can go down there. But months later, the three survivors had such intense survivor's guilt that they would actually illegally go back to Plura Cave and retrieve their bodies. In the 1930s, notorious dictator Joseph Stalin began deporting people that he viewed as threats to the regime. Now, at first, that was just political opponents, and he rounded up thousands of those. But over time, Stalin just started rounding up anybody he didn't like. And so as more and more people were deported, Stalin needed a place to put them. The option he settled on was sending these people to Siberia because it was thousands of miles away from civilization. And the way he saw it is they wouldn't be a threat to the regime anymore because they'd be too busy just trying to survive. Eventually, millions of people were deported to Siberia to fend for themselves, and many people died in the process. But the worst fate of anybody deported to Siberia has to be the roughly 7,000 people that were sent to Nazino Island off the western side of Siberia. In May of 1933, the first 5,000 deportees that would be sent to Nazino Island arrived on its shores. Now, they had been packed inside of barges. Many of them were weak or sick, and so disease quickly spread. And just by the time they arrived, 27 people had already died just in transit. As the survivors disembark onto this snowy island, they see immediately that there's nothing on it. It's this tiny little island. There's no shelter. There's no food. There's no tools. There's no way to make shelter. They're just totally stranded. Their Soviet guards had promised them a ration of flour, but for the first 4 days, they refused to give it to them, and another 295 people died. And to make matters worse, after a couple of days, another almost 2,000 people were shipped out to this island. And so by the time the guards actually took their boats into shore to give the flour to these people, they were starving to death, and they rushed the boats to try to steal the flour, and the guards began shooting at them, took the flour, and went back out to the water. The next day, they came back in to try to give them the flour, and the same thing happened. And so they went back out to the water, and they orchestrated this plan where for every 150 prisoners, there would be a brigadier. And that brigadier would be in charge of coming out and getting the flour and then bringing it back to those 150. But the brigadiers were all criminals, and they would come out, take the flour, and then not distribute it. And so no one got any flour, so no one could eat anything. And the people who did get flour rations mixed it with water, and then they would eat that raw, and it gave them dysentery, and then they died. Totally desperate, these deportees began constructing these crude rafts and began trying to cross the river to the other side, but many of them broke apart and they would drown in the freezing waters. And if they didn't drown, the guards would see them crossing and would take shots at them. And so if they didn't drown or get shot and they did make it to the other side, they'd be in the Siberian wasteland with no supplies and they would die there too. And so Nazino Island completely devolved into chaos. Almost immediately, cannibalism became a thing, and there were these roving gangs of people that were the strongest and fittest of the island who would just go around and murder the weak and eat them. And the guards that were watching this did nothing to stop it, and frankly couldn't if they wanted to, because you've now reached the absolute extremes of human survival. One local woman who would make an annual trip to Nazino Island before there were people being deported there made her annual trip and was shocked to see all these people on this island that normally had no one there. And she said from her boat, she watched this group of people run up on this woman, drag her to a tree, they tied her to the tree, and then began cutting off pieces of her while she was alive and eating it right in front of her. And then after the group had left, the woman who was tied to the tree was still alive, and what looked like her partner, her boyfriend, her husband comes over, tries to untie her, he tries to save her, but there's nothing he can do, and she dies in his arms. Another local who managed to save a woman from Nazino Island, she got her into her house and she sat her down, and she noticed that the backs of her legs were all bandaged up. And she asked her what was going on with the backs of her legs, and she undid her dressing, and her calf muscles on her legs were gone. Someone had cut them off and eaten them. Of the nearly 7,000 people that were sent to Nazino Island, only 2,000 remained at the end of the first month they were there. And in fact, when word got out to Stalin that this island had become Cannibal Island, he actually shut it down and moved the remaining 2,000 deportees to another labor camp where unfortunately many of them died as well. And sadly, those few thousand people only represent a fraction of the massive number of people that died during Stalin's many purges.